Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to descend into the secret tombs buried deep beneath Westminster Abbey where the silence is so thick. It feels like centuries are breathing all around you and uncover what truly awaits inside the coffin of Queen Elizabeth I. Try to picture it, candlelight flickering against cold lead. A suffocating atmosphere heavy with secrets no history book has dared to reveal. This isn't the polished, glorified tale of the Virgin Queen you learned in school. This is the chapter no one wants you to know, the one where power and glory finally bow to decay. Where the golden mask slips to reveal something raw, terrifying, and, to be honest, something that may make you question whether we ever truly understand what royalty means. And trust me, if you think you're brave enough not to flinch at the sight of a mummified monarch, you might want to reconsider, because you definitely won't survive this if you're still clinging to any illusions about immortality. So before you truly settle in, take a few seconds to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we're doing here. I'd really love to know where you're watching from, and what time is it there right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. When the final tomb door closed above their heads, the first people brave enough to touch the lead coffin of Elizabeth I, I understood that no ceremony, no medal, no sacred mission could save a body from the shared fate of us all. They stood there, in the flickering light of torches and oil lamps, silent as they gazed at the rotted black velvet clinging to what was once the body of a queen, and they saw the truth with their own eyes. Beneath the glittering crowns lay a primal fear, the fear of being forgotten, destroyed, turned into something no longer human. Records tell that when the royal physicians opened the coffin, they had to turn away from the stench that hit their throats, a smell, both sour and sweet, lingering like a reminder no one could ignore. It was the scent of a body that had undergone multiple stages of decay, arrested by chemicals, only to quietly resume dissolving over the centuries. Before her death, Elizabeth once whispered to a lady-in-waiting that what she feared most wasn't dying, it was what would happen to her body afterward. She had seen her own father, Henry VIII, placed in a coffin the size of a small room, only for his bloated body to burst, spilling blood and fluid through the wood and onto the chapel floor. She had sworn, "I will not let myself become a final mockery." But that vow could not withstand reality. When trembling hands began to touch the burial cloth, they found that the wax mask once molded to cover her face had cracked, melted, and merged into the decaying flesh beneath. The dark red wig remained lustrous, clinging to a skull that had collapsed as if scorched. A head half real, half false, familiar and alien enough to chill the soul. And in that moment, all solemn reverence dissolved into something strange. Pity. Pity for the woman who once made all of Europe tremble, now lying still as a reminder that no one, no even the famed Glorionicon, escaped the cruelty of time. Generations have bestowed upon Elizabeth countless titles: Mother of the Nation, the Virgin Queen, the Sunday Monarch. But in that dim vault, before the coarse stitches along her abdomen, before the burnt stench of a hollowed corpse packed with spices, every title lost its meaning. Tonight, as you listen to this story, ask yourself, can any of us, no matter how powerful, truly control how we will be forgotten or remembered? Is there any immortality that doesn't bear the distorted face of decomposition? Because perhaps the harshest truth that Coffin revealed wasn't just the disintegrated form of Elizabeth, it was the decay of the illusion of power itself, an illusion built over generations by kings, queens, and prideful ambition. We are about to descend deeper into that story, deeper into a crypt where prayers and sobs have long fallen silent, leaving only the cold breath of secrets no one dares confront. If you're still here, take a slow breath, because what you're about to hear next will forever change how you look at every statue, every throne, every epic that sings of eternal glory. Imagine this with me. You're standing on damp, cold stone, your breath dissolving into darkness. surrounded by 4 centuries of silence layered upon each other. Before you is the massive lead coffin, once cast to protect the body of Elizabeth I from the ravages of time. But no metal is thick enough to stop death from doing its work. When Victorian investigators finally broke through the lead seal, they were not prepared for what they saw. They had expected a skeleton or a perfectly preserved forma noble relic, worthy of the title Virgin Queen. Oh, instead, their lanterns cast a flickering light on a shapeless mess, where human flesh, perfumes, beeswax, and wigs had melted into a nameless mass. They said that in that moment, all legends about Elizabeth collapsed. No longer the proud queen who defeated the Spanish Armada. No longer the woman who declared her heart was as strong as any king's. Only a relic half illusion. Half wrote as if history itself had chosen to strip away the final truth. All power eventually melts into black sludge. Someone wrote in his diary that as he bent over the coffin, he felt like he was looking into a mirror, and what he saw was the end of us alla, nameless body. I turned into a macabre joke by its own longing for permanence. They found the coronation ring, loose among the bone fragments, a rotted symbol. They found her heart, the one once called the Heart of England, crystallized into a toxic gem, glittering under oil light, both breathtaking and suffocating. Can you imagine it? A heart that once raced in fury as she signed death warrants, that once burned with pride as news came of the Armada shattered by storms, that once ached with loneliness in the cold nights of the palace, now reduced to a strange gray gem, containing not only poison, but the sorrow of a life spent fighting to stop the body from leaking further through the coffin. They poured in layers of tar and sealed it again with molten lead. As they worked, they heard the faint hissing of decomposed gas escaping like the final whispers of someone who refused to be forgotten. That night, as they emerged from the tomb, hands still trembling, they knew they had just witnessed Elizabeth's second death, the death of all legend, and they understood this could never be revealed to the public, because what would happen if the plagiarized on tales of an immortal, glorious queen discovered that her corpse had turned into such a bizarre, chemical laboratory? But you and I, tonight, don't need to avoid that question. Because this story isn't just about a monarch. It's about all of us, those living under the illusion that fame, wealth, or praise will preserve us from nature's decaying hand. Let your mind return to Elizabeth's final night at Richmond Palace. She stood on swollen legs from illness, refusing to lie down, as if staying upright could keep her alive. Her ladies-in-waiting held her trembling body, silently weeping because they knew that once she took her last breath, nothing would preserve her royal majesty. And when that final breath vanished into the air, Elizabeth Gloriana, mother of the nation, the Virgin Queen, became once more an old, exhausted woman. Nothing more, nothing less. Tonight, in this quiet darkness, as you listen to this tale, ask yourself, if all glory eventually turns into a cloying stench of rot, then what truly matters? What are we striving for? Or are we only racing toward the day when our own heart becomes a gleaming, meaningless poison stone? The answer is not easy to find. But perhaps, simply daring to face it makes you different from those who spend their lives running from the truth. If you're still here, take a deep breath, because this story is only just beginning. And so, when the lead coffin was sealed for the last time, a dynasty quietly closed its door. Those who had stood there, hands still trembling from what they had seen, spoke to no one of the terrible details, of the wax mask melted down over the cheekbones, of the auburn wig floating above the decay beneath, as if mocking it, of the strange clunking sound, as if something inside the coffin refused to settle. When they returned, the journals were locked away, sealed with wax. But no matter how deep the paperwork was buried, none of them could forget, because it wasn't just the memory of a corpse, it was the memory of a legend's collapse, of the moment they realized every monument will crumble to dust. Every praise will vanish like incense smoke in a damp crypt. And yet, the story didn't end there. Years later, When modern scientists reopened the old files, they found detailed descriptions of the crystal heart of poison recovered from the coffin, a small object, glittering like a gray gem, formed from a strange blend of lead, mercury, resins, and decomposition fluids. The moment one researcher saw it through the lens, he whispered, "This is the last remnant of pride, a heart that once believed itself immortal." That sentence hung heavy in the archive room, pressing down on everyone present. They tried to explain, why did a woman fear death so much she wouldn't lie down? Why did she insist over and over that her body be left untouched? Was it because Elizabeth knew better than anyone that power is only a loose-fitting garment and, once it falls away, what remains is no different from any other mortal? But even knowing that, she couldn't resist. She couldn't escape the surgeons with their gleaming blades and iron rods to extract her brain through her nose. She couldn't avoid the layers of spices, turpentine, and strong liquor poured over her corpse to prolong the illusion that her body would remain intact forever. Perhaps that's the cruelest paradox of all. The harder we try to cling to immortality, the more grotesque our decay becomes, an incomplete decomposition, sometimes melting, sometimes crystallizing, sometimes swelling as if the corpse itself resists its fate. When they sealed the crypt with heavy stones, no one imagined that centuries later, the story would be unearthed again. But truth always finds a way out, like rot seeping through the cracks of a coffin. And once it does, no one can pretend they didn't see. You may sit here, in darkness, telling yourself that age has passed, that today, everything is more civilized, cleaner, kinder. But ask yourself, if one day someone opens your coffin, what would they see? If one day, a future generation unseals the urn, lifts the burial cloth, will you have the courage to let them see you as you truly were? Because in the end, Elizabeth wasn't the only one trying to hide. We all are. We paint our lives with layers of gold, craft beautiful portrait, and tell glorious stories to forget the ending that no one can escape. Do you remember the moment they cracked open the coffin? The lantern light falling on the shattered wax mask? They saw not just a decomposed face, but the remnants of obsessive rituals that followed Elizabeth to her grave. From here, our story leads back to her living years, when every eye fixated on the flawless white complexion of the Virgin Queen, never knowing the terrible price paid for it. Tonight, close your eyes and imagine this scene: a chamber in Hampton Court Palace, the window slightly ajar, letting in the morning breeze that stirs the heavy velvet curtains. Elizabeth sits before a large silver mirror, her gaunt face reflected in the flickering candlelight. Since early morning, her ladies-in-waiting have silently prepared for a meticulous ritual not unlike receiving ambassadors or signing royal decrees. The care of the Queen's beauty. No one dared touch her roughly. Every gesture had to be featherlight, for even the slightest scratch could become the subject of court gossip. Elizabeth believed that the awe of her courtier son, in part, her very power depended on her flawless white skin, a symbol of purity, removed from common folk. But few knew that this whiteness was not a gift of nature. It was the result of a homemade cosmetic blend called Venetian cerusia powder made of white lead and vinegar. Each morning, the ladies mixed a pale gray paste, brushing it thickly across her face, neck, even her hands, layer upon layer, masking freckles, pock scars, and age while the slow poison seeped into her bloodstream. Imagine its scent, the sharp tang of vinegar, the dull metallic odor of lead, faintly masked by rose oil. Elizabeth closed her eyes, tilted her head, letting them work in silence. Perhaps in that moment, she no longer felt human, but like a living statuette figure to be admired and feared. Her routine did not stop at lead. She used cinnabar powder to blush her cheeks and color her lips. Cinnabar, bright red mineral ground from mercury sulfide, another toxin pressed into her delicate skin. And to set the makeup for the day, she dusted her face with fragrant powder made from crushed, dried flowers and ambergris. But each night, when the candles dimmed, the perfection had to be peeled away. Her ladies gently wiped the mask with a blend of wine and eggs, revealing the real face beneath the wavering candlelight. They say Elizabeth's skin began to bloom with dark red blotches, blisters, and patches that peeled like brittle paper. Some nights, she stared into the mirror, softly touching her cheek. The skin was wrinkled, cracked, aching, yet she nodded firmly. The powder would go on again in the morning. Though it destroyed her, she would not stop using it, because that beauty was the only shield left between her crown and her enemies' whispers. This beauty ritual lasted 4 decades. Beneath those painted layers, her body withered, hair falling in clumps, teeth rotting into blackened spikes, breath sweetened with the metallic stench of heavy metals. But Elizabeth allowed no one to speak of it. Once, a young lady in waiting accidentally dropped the jar of Venetian ceruse on the floor. Terrified, she fell to her knees to retrieve it, hands trembling. "Have you forgotten? Without it, I'm just a common old woman." It was that ruthlessness toward others and herself that shaped the Elizabeth Europe came to fear. A queen who understood that power wasn't just armies or taxes. Power was myth. And myth must be painted, even with poison. On her final night, when her body was spent and her throat swollen with rot, no one dared wipe the powder from her face. They dressed her in a black velvet gown, adjusted the red wig, and draped a silk veil over her cracked features as if pretending the queen still lived in her beauty. But once the coffin was sealed, that powder could not save her from decay. It only turned the corpse into a laboratory of toxins where lead, mercury, and flesh fused into a grotesque chemical sludge. So it was the very morning of hair combing, every night of makeup removal, every thick layer of white that masked age did not shield her from fate. It only made it more terrible. Tonight, in the darkness of your room, as this story seeps into your thoughts, ask yourself, how much of our lives are we painting over? And in the end, does it matter? When every layer must fall away? If you're still here, I'll tell you the final hours of Elizabeth when she could no longer stand. And the ultimate truth emerged. That power, beauty, and reverence were only masks, as fragile as the powder on a dying queen's face. And then, after 4 decades of building that perfect mask, Elizabeth could stand no longer. In the last days of March 1603, the air in Richmond Palace turned strangely cold, as if the stone walls were preparing to receive her final breath. The maid said she kept holding onto the arm of her chair, refusing to lie down, believing that once she reclined, she would never rise again. At dawn, as sunlight filtered through velvet drapes, Elizabeth sat motionless, eyes wide open, lips pressed shut. The lead paint was thicker than ever that day, hiding purple speckles on her cheeks and deep shadows around her eyes. But no illusion was strong enough now to deceive even herself. Beneath that skin, death was spreading through every nerve, every heavy heartbeat, every stabbing pain along her spine. One night, an old lady in waiting who had served her for 30 years gently asked, "Your Majesty, please rest for a while. All of England awaits your final words." "Dow." Elizabeth simply shook her head, her voice rough. "If I lie down, I shall not get up again." "Dow, perhaps, to the very end." She could not cast off her greatest fear, the fear of being forgotten, disrespected, seen as a loser to illness and age. But her body had betrayed her. The fever climbed, her throat swelled with a pustule that rotted and stank, her breath thick with the sweet sour scent of metal and wilted flowers. Each time the maids wiped her lips, they suppressed their gagging and bowed low, not daring to let her see their terrified eyes. On the final night, Elizabeth still wore her black velvet gown, her wig neatly combed, a ruby-studded gold ring on her swollen finger. They say, as the candlelight dimmed, she lifted a trembling hand to touch her face, as if to ensure the powder was still intact. That was the last time her hand moved. When her body slowly pitched forward, the ladies in waiting rushed to catch her, trying to keep her upright, though they knew it was pointless. A heavy sigh and then silence filled the room. Elizabeth y Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, Mother of England, died trying to remain standing. The story could end there, if not for one final glimpse by those present. They say a breeze slipped through the door crack, swaying the curtain, making the wig flutter slightly. In that moment, all the makeup, the perfume, the artificial red on her lips, it all looked as fragile as the final shell of a lifelong battle. And then, when she was finally laid down on a bed for the first time in weeks, the truth was revealed. The white powder had hardened into flakes. The skin beneath was cracked, ulcerated, and bruised. The scent of disease rose mingling with lead, cinnabar, and the smell of flesh on the brink of decay. In that moment, Elizabeth was no longer a symbol. She was just an exhausted woman, no longer exempt from the ordinary laws of flesh. The next day, a lead coffin was hastily cast. In case her body decomposed faster than anyone dared admit, the physicians quietly prepared the embalming tool scalpels, long rods to extract the brain through the nose, copper buckets to collect blood and bodily fluids. They knew she had sworn that no one would touch her corpse, but they also knew that no deathbed vow could override royal ritual. They began their work in silence, each cold blade slicing through powder-caked, crumbling skin, and though not a word was spoken, everyone understood. All the years she had defied aging, every layer of paint that masked her fear had only postponed this moment. The moment Elizabeth became again a mere mortal body, vulnerably, grotesque. Today, as we sit calmly and listen to this story, it's easy to think we are different from her, that we don't blindly chase the illusion of immortality, that we are humble enough to accept aging. But let's be honest with ourselves. If you could apply a powder that made the world believe you were stronger, younger, more eternal, are you sure you would refuse? And yet, when the crypt door closed and her flesh began to decay beneath that cold lead, one thing remained incorruptible. What Elizabeth I had achieved, because it's easy for us, in the 21st century, to look back and judge a woman who once wore the heaviest crown in Europe, who cloaked herself in toxic makeup, who feared the thin line between glory and oblivion. But if we place ourselves in the year 1558, the moment she ascended the throne, we begin to understand why she had to hold everything together. Elizabeth did not inherit a strong, united, and prosperous England. She took over a nation crippled by religious division, drowning in debt, surrounded by the ambitions of Spain and France. The previous reign of Mary Tudor, her half-sister, had turned everything to ruin. Mass executions, the fear of Catholic resurgence, a populace that had lost faith. And yet, within one generation, Elizabeth accomplished the unthinkable. She transformed England into a maritime superpower and the most dazzling cultural center in Europe. When we view the broader picture, her achievements gleam like stars scattered across the dark sky of her era. She laid a stable foundation for the Church of England, avoiding the religious civil wars that tore France and Germany apart for centuries. She skillfully maintained balance between Protestant and Catholic factions, keeping England from descending into chaos. She built the most sophisticated spy network in Europe, led by Francis Walsingham, web of intelligence that foiled dozens of assassination plots and coups. She encouraged explorers to set sail, laying the groundwork for the future British Empire. Unwind. The arts, literature, and theater flourished. The golden age of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and countless poets and artists, and perhaps her greatest, though rarely acknowledged, and achievement, she maintained lifelong sovereignty without ever marrying. In an era where every female monarch was pressured to wed for support, Elizabeth masterfully wielded promises, negotiations, and diplomatic dialogues, turning her single status into a sharp political weapon. Imagine a young woman, seated across from the Spanish ambassador, who endlessly mentioned marriage proposals from the Archduke of Austria or the King of France. She simply smiled and replied gently, "I am already married to England." And from that line, a legend was born, the Virgin Queen, the unyielding symbol of a nation. But don't think she relied solely on words. Elizabeth did not hesitate to hang or behead traitors. She signed the death warrant for Mary Stuart, her cousin, and most dangerous political rival, knowing full well it would make Europe hate her. She ordered the navy to face off against the mighty Armada and defeated the richest empire in the world, Spain. That victory didn't just protect England's independence, it declared that this was no longer a small, frightened nation cowering in Europe's shadows. When news arrived that the Armada had been shattered by storms and English cannon fire, Elizabeth quietly stepped into the Tilbury camp. Clad in silver armor, holding her scepter, she stood before the soldiers, her voice firm. "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king of England." In that moment, all doubts about her capabilities vanished. No one dared mock the woman without a husband. No longer did anyone speak of the throne as a prize for some foreign prince. And that's what Elizabeth achieved. She turned limits into strength, solitude into legend, and the harshness of her era into the opportunity to carve her name into history. Perhaps that's why even after her coffin was opened, and her body was found rotted into a slurry of poison and black sludge, one could forget all she had built. And then the story shifts. When Elizabeth's reign ended, it became awkwardly clear she left no direct heir. The throne stood empty. And all the achievements, all the legends, all the sacred images, had to be handed over to another man, James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Stuart, the very enemy Elizabeth had ordered executed. That was Elizabeth's final paradox, that after a lifetime of guarding her power in death, the crown passed to the bloodline of the woman she had refused to spare. And from there, a new age began, the Stuart era, the time of Cromwell, of civil wars that would rip England apart. But even if everything fell, her name remained both dazzling and terrifying, because perhaps it was the contradiction between a glorious reign and a ghastly death that made Elizabeth a symbol, the radiant beauty of power, and the raw truth that waits beneath it. Looking back through history, who could have imagined that the woman who once made all of Europe tremble was born under a heavy cloud of disappointment on the 7th of September, 1533, in Greenwich Palace? Anne Boleyn gave birth to her first child. Everyone awaited a savior for the Tudor lineal boy. But when the midwife whispered, "It's a girl," Henry VIII's face darkened. He did not remain in the room, did not hold the newborn. And from that very first moment, Elizabeth knew, though she didn't yet have the words for it, that she was a disappointment. Later, historians tried to paint Henry as a loving father. But the truth is, deep down, he saw Elizabeth's birth as a humiliation. He had broken from the Pope, divorced Catherine of Aragon, overturned the entire religious structure of his kingdom, all to marry Anne and produce a daughter. Try to imagine that scene. A room draped in deep red curtains, candlelight flickering across Anne Boleyn's exhausted face, beside her, and a silk-lined cradle, where Elizabeth sleeps, a tiny being, unaware that she has just shattered so many hopes. Henry looked at the child for a few seconds, then turned away, without offering a single blessing. When Elizabeth was only a few months old, the court was already discussing the need for another heir, and in those conversations, no one spoke of Elizabeth as a successor. She was merely a backup, a possession to be tucked away, while her parents continued trying for a son. At age 3, disaster struck. Anne Boleyn was accused of treason, adultery, and incest charges that many historians now believe were largely fabricated. In a single morning in May, her mother was led to the scaffold at Tower Green, knelt on the straw mat, and placed her neck on the block. No one knows where Elizabeth was that day. Some records suggest she was kept in a locked room, forbidden to witness it. But still, She heard the battle drums, the funeral trumpet, the thud of the axe. And then came the terrifying silence, the silence of a child who had just lost her mother and become an orphan rejected by her father. Henry VIII did not attend Anne's funeral, nor did he allow Elizabeth to attend. Instead, the 3-year-old was sent away. Her status instantly altered, from princess to Lady Elizabeth, stripped of succession rights and royal titles. At just 3 years old, she learned what it meant to have her life determined by the power games of adults. Think of that every time you see a portrait of Queen Elizabeth in resplendent gowns, holding a scepter. Behind those resolute eyes is the memory of a child raised in coldness, never called by name with affection, never openly loved. A child who learned to survive by burying every emotion deep inside. As she grew older, Elizabeth was allowed to return to court, but not as a princess, only as Lady Elizabeth. Yeah, every step she took was watched. Every word, every gesture was scrutinized, for fear she would become a threat like her mother. And yet, those years of abandonment forged the hardest armor. She learned to conceal fear, sorrow, and even pride. There's a small story that says a lot. When Elizabeth was around 10 years old, a servant accidentally mentioned her mother at the dinner table. Henry VIII scolded him harshly. Elizabeth said nothing, only sat still, eyes fixed on her silver goblet, hands clenched white. After the meal, she quietly walked into the garden and sat alone for hours. No tears, no complaints, just a child learning how to swallow bitterness in silence. Perhaps that's why, when Elizabeth took the throne at age 25, she was unlike any queen before her. She never asked for pity. She didn't need protection. And she never let anyone see her weakness. All the victories that followed the Armada, the golden cultural age, the image of the Virgin Queen came from a child unrecognized by her father. Motherless, with no shoulder to lean on. If we want to understand why Elizabeth was rejected by her father at birth, we must go back one more generation to when Henry VIII was a young prince, raised under the shadow of a terrifying fear that the Tudor line could die out at any moment. As a child, Henry watched his father Henry VIII spend his life fighting to keep the throne. The Tudor dynasty was not a long-standing, noble house. They were upstarts, having risen after a bloody civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. When Henry VII died, the English throne was still far from secure. All the powerful men in the kingdom whispered, if the king does not have a male heir, this dynasty will fall. And that fear haunted Henry VIII for the rest of his life. He didn't just want an heir, he needed a son. Because to him, a son wasn't just a child, it was proof that he hadn't failed the way his father had feared. A shield to prevent the Tudor dynasty from being swallowed by the ambitions of old families like the Yorks or the Plantagenets. As a young man, Henry VIII was famous for his athletic build, his love of sport, his passion for the arts, and a courtly charm that dazzled his courtiers. But deep inside, he was fragile and haunted by the curse of having no son. Catherine of Aragon's first wife was a noble Spanish princess, wise and virtuous. She became pregnant at least 6 times, but out of all those pregnancies, only one child survived, a girl named Mary. Henry tried to reassure himself that a son would come, but as the years passed, and Catherine endured miscarriage after miscarriage, a part of his faith shattered each time. When Catherine became too old to bear children, Henry fell into despair. In his eyes, all the sacrifices, the diplomatic alliance, the grand wedding with Spain, it all meant nothing if he died without a male heir. Then Anne Boleyn appeared, so different from Catherine Young, elegant, sharp-witted, and, most importantly, Anne refused to be a mistress. She wanted everything or nothing, to be a lawful wife. And for her child to be the heir, picture a Henry VIII, desperate for a son to the brink of madness. And across from him, Anne, a woman unafraid of power, of scandal, of the court itself. She had a strange magnetism, bold and cool, ready to risk everything to become queen. Henry was besotted. He believed Anne was destiny, that she was the one who would bear the prince to secure the Tudor line. That belief was so powerful that Henry was willing to destroy every religious and political boundary to marry Anne. He caused an unprecedented crisis, divorcing Catherine, accepting excommunication from the Pope, establishing the Church of England, breaking away from Rome, stripping the Catholic clergy of power, seizing church lands. All of it was staked on a single hope, that Anne Boleyn would bear a son. In September 1533, Anne gave birth to Elizabeth. Henry had prepared everything for the celebration of a son. Medals were already forged with the image of a prince. But when the newborn's cry echoed and the midwife announced, "It's a girl," all the excitement collapsed. Still, at first, Henry tried to stay hopeful. He told his court, "We are young yet. A son will come." But Anne knew better. She understood her position was fragile. She knew that if she didn't bear a son, she would be cast aside. In the years that followed, Anne became pregnant twice more. One miscarriage, one stillbirth. Some say it was a boy. That was the moment Anne realized the tragedy had been sealed. And Henry, once madly in love, began to turn away. He grew cold, prone to rage, withdrawn. Every time he looked at Elizabeth, he didn't see a clever child with Anne's bright eyes. He saw a living reminder that all his sacrifices had been in vain. When Anne was arrested, accused of adultery and treason, Henry did nothing to defend her. They say he even felt relieved finally. He had a reason to erase the marriage that had brought him disgrace. On the day Anne Boleyn was executed, Henry wore bright yellow, a color of new beginnings. Just days later, he became engaged to Jane Seymour's third wife, the one he believed would bear him a son. And in a bitter twist of fate, Jane did give birth to Edward VI, the long-awaited prince, but she died only days after childbirth. Elizabeth, then only 3 years old, it was demoted from princess to Lady Elizabeth. And everyone around her was ordered not to call her Your Highness. In Henry's eyes, she was a persistent reminder of failure and loss. And here lies the painful paradox. Henry VIII feared most not having a son to secure the dynasty. Yet in the end, it was Elizabeth, the unwanted daughter, who ruled longest and led England to its greatest glory. A father who tore apart the church for a prince. A mother who risked her life to become queen. A child raised in the rejection of them both. And yet, from that shadowed place, Elizabeth forged herself into the greatest queen in history. On the morning of May 19, 1536, the sky over London was grey, the wind cutting through the cold stone walls of the tower, making the black mourning flags snap sharply. In the small cobbled courtyard, a silent crowd stood packed tightly together. But no one dared to breathe too loud, because that day, a queen would be executed. Anne Boleyn, mother of Elizabeth. Anne wore a pale grey dress, trimmed with black, and a French silk hood on her head. She walked slowly between two lines of guards, her expression eerily calm, as if she had already passed beyond fear. But deep down, Anne surely understood. Every dream of power she had traded her life for had now turned to smoke. As she stepped onto the scaffold, Anne glanced toward the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where her body would be hastily buried. It said she pressed her lips together, a final effort not to weep. Then Anne knelt, holding a small silk pouch containing a gold coin payment for the executioner. One of her ladies removed her jewelry and adjusted her collar to reveal her pale neck. Her thick black hair was tucked neatly under her hood. The executioner that day was a French swordsman, brought in to grant her a more merciful death. When he drew his blade from the scabbard, the steel caught a glint of cold silver light. Anne took a deep breath. She raised her voice. "O good Christian people, I do not accuse anyone. I come here not to complain. But to pray you will pray for the king, for he is still my sovereign lord. IW, some said her voice trembled. Others claimed she was unnervingly composed. But all agreed. In that moment, Anne was no longer a queen. She was just a mother. Knowing her 3-year-old daughter would never understand why her mother vanished. When Anne tilted her head to the side and folded her hands in prayer, the swordsman gave a signal for the lady to step away. He softly called out a phrase in French to distract her so she wouldn't flinch, and as Anne turned her eyes to the gray sky, the sword swung. A swift, clean blow. The head fell onto the straw mat, black hair spilling loose. Blood splattered in a red arc across the still warm gray dress. The crowd released a collective breath, unclear if it was sorrow, horror, or relief. A woman who had once ruled England knelt before her fate, and in a single flash, all glory, all scandal, all pride ended. Anne's body was not buried as a queen. It was placed in a crude wooden chest that once held arrows. No tombstone, no funeral rites, no farewell. Just a few weeping ladies in waiting, while guards shoveled earth over the shallow grave. And then, the story veered into another tragedy. Elsewhere, in a distant corner of Greenwich Palace, a 3-year-old child still didn't understand what had happened. Elizabeth was not allowed to see her mother one last time. No one dared tell her the truth that her mother had become an enemy of the throne for failing to produce a prince. Records state that in the days following, Elizabeth was taken away, cut off from the court. The title princess was stripped, the honorific Her Highness vanished. And Henry VIII, her father, did not bother to look upon his daughter's face, perhaps because he could not bear the sight of eyes too much like Anne's. To the court, Elizabeth was now a pitiful child bearing the blood of a woman condemned as a traitor. No one dared show her affection openly. No one dared show pity, for fear of drawing danger upon themselves. And so, Elizabeth's childhood began with a silence no one explained, a sorrow no one named, a mark that would never fade. Later historians remarked, it was the moment she lost her mother that taught Elizabeth a brutal lesson. Trust no one. Never show your heart. Never let tears become a weakness. When that child learned how to be hard, learned to hide emotions behind a mask of silence, learned to use intelligence to survive a court willing to kill anyone. And from the core of that tragedy, Elizabeth nurtured an ambition. If she were ever given power, she would never let it be stripped away like it was from her mother. After Anne Boleyn's death, Elizabeth's life veered into a darker path. She was no longer the Princess of England, just a 3-year-old child stripped of title, seen by her father as a burden to be hidden. Henry VIII married almost immediately after Jane Seymour, a gentler, less ambitious woman than Anne. Jane bore no ill will toward Elizabeth, but she dared not show affection either, for fear of angering the king. And so, within the very palace that once was her home, Elizabeth became a stranger. Servants avoided her gaze. Courtiers did not bow. Banquets had no place for a demoted child. Elizabeth was sent to Hatfield House, an estate far from the center of power. There, she was raised with a handful of tutors and silent maids, learning to cling to knowledge to fill the void left by a lack of love. Day by day, the red-haired girl read Latin texts, copied verses from the Bible, memorized classical poetry. She learned so quickly that her tutors were stunned. By age 6, she spoke fluent French. At 7, she played the lute. At 8, she recited Homer in Greek. And it is said that, having no mother and no warmth, Elizabeth poured everything into her intellect, the one thing she believed could never be taken from her. But the court did not leave her in peace for long. When Elizabeth was 4, Jane Seymour gave birth to Prince Edward. That was the moment Henry VIII felt the weight of his lifelong obsession lift at last. He had a son. From that moment, Elizabeth became invisible. All ceremony, all attention, shifted to the tiny Edward, the rightful heir. Elizabeth's allowance was cut, her staff reduced. She wore hand-me-down dresses refitted from other princesses. Yet less than 2 weeks after Edward's birth, Jane Seymour died from postnatal complications. Henry Octaver Capricious fell into a deep gloom. But that sorrow did not lead him to remember the older daughter who remained alone at Hatfield. Then came more royal marriages. The fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, arrived from far-off Germany. Their marriage was rushed. Henry met her only once before the wedding. He was disappointed on the wedding night and divorced her quickly. The fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was only 6 or 7 years older than Elizabeth. Catherine was cheerful, naive, and at times tried to show affection to Elizabeth, but then she too was accused of adultery and executed a repeating tragedy that taught Elizabeth even more clearly. The court was no place for love. That child learned that everything affection, status, favor could vanish with a single swing of a sword. And from then on, she trained herself never to trust, never to let anyone close to her heart. There is a small story still recorded in old documents. One winter day, Elizabeth was allowed to visit court. She entered the great hall where her father was holding court. People whispered, glancing at her fiery red hair so much like Anne Boleyn's. Henry VIII, now old and bloated, sat on the throne and stared at his daughter in silence. No one knew what he was thinking. Perhaps he remembered Anne. Perhaps he felt guilt. But in the end, he spoke just one sentence. "You have grown." Then he turned away without another word. And Elizabeth, only 8 years old at the time, bowed her head low, so no one would see the tears welling in her eyes. Later, when she became queen, Elizabeth often refused to speak of her mother, but those closest to her would recount. In her private chambers hung a small ring that opened to reveal a portrait of Anne Boleyn. Some nights, she was seen sitting alone, turning the ring in her fingers, eyes distant as if still the child searching for answers. Why was my mother killed? Why did my father never truly want to hold me? Perhaps that was the root of everything, because she was unloved in childhood. Elizabeth grew up determined to rely on no one. No husband. No children. No one would ever be allowed close to her heart again. As Elizabeth entered adolescence, the Tudor dynasty was once again in upheaval. Henry VIII died in 1547, leaving the throne to his only son Edward Vichist, 9 years old. A kingdom ruled by a child meant a court full of power-hungry men scrambling for control. Elizabeth, then about 13 or 14, returned to court. But she wasn't a beloved princess. She was Lady Elizabeth, the red-haired girl known as the daughter of a convicted traitor. The court was split into factions. One supported Edward A. Protestant lords, eager to steer England further from Catholicism. The other plotted to restore Catholic rule. They placed their hopes in Mary, Elizabeth's half-sister. In this tug-of-war, Elizabeth was merely a pawn, but the most dangerous pawn, because she was precociously intelligent and possessed a strange magnetism. Even as a teenager, she had a gaze that made people feel both admiration and unease. Everyone understood, if they didn't control Elizabeth, one day she could become the heart of a rebellion. But the most pivotal turning point came after Henry's death. With King Edward still a child, the court granted the role of Lord Protector to Thomas Seymour, a man both ambitious and calculating. Thomas married Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's final wife, and brought Elizabeth to live with them in their new household. At first, everyone believed Catherine Parr genuinely loved Elizabeth. Catherine had cared for her as a child, had once shielded her from court suspicion. Elizabeth, orphaned for as long as she could remember, seemed to finally find a touch of familial warmth. But Thomas Seymour was different. He did not see Elizabeth merely as a child to be raised, but as a political asset. Perhaps even as a blooming young woman with an increasingly radiant beauty. Records tell us that every morning, when Elizabeth awoke, Thomas would already be waiting. He would enter her room, tease her, stroke her hair, sometimes pat her back with the excuse of stepfatherly affection. Catherine at first laughed it off. But gradually, things grew strange. Boundaries blurred. One morning, Thomas grabbed Elizabeth's arm and forced her to participate in a joke that went too far. That very day, Catherine, pregnant, at the time witnessed the scene and could take no more. Elizabeth was expelled from the house that night. Without a farewell, a servant escorted her to another estate, where she once again returned to isolation, this time with a cloud of scandal hanging over her. The rumor of a young girl who had seduced her stepfather. Elizabeth was only 15. Her childhood as an orphan had not yet taught her how cruel the world could be, but the moment she was cast out from the only home she ever considered her own, she understood. No one is safe. No one truly loves.